village Wisewomen, and they live in St. Barrian, which is in West Cornwall. They kindly helped with the current exhibition, She Cares, Women and Health in Cornwall, and they are included in their exhibition. So Laetitia recently brought out a book called Be Careful What You Wish For, From Cult to Occult. The second part of this story, Apprentice of the Old Craft, is due for release in March 2024. And so we've got her first book in our collection here, and we will definitely be getting the next one. So Cassandra is the author of Village Witch, Life as a Village Wise Woman in the Wilds of West Cornwall. And today they will be talking about the history of village wise women and their contemporary practice. So this talk will also explore themes including becoming an apprentice, the creation of charms, and spellcasting. So I'm really looking forward to this talk and really enjoyed doing some research into our collection about the history of village wise women. So it's really amazing that Cassandra and Laetitia have agreed to give a talk. So now over to both of you, please.
Right. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon from deepest, darkest Cornwall. Wise women. It's a term that's been around for a while. There's always, in a sense, been healers within a community or a tribe. And certainly, I believe that to be the case. However, when it comes to documented evidence, then alas, that's a little bit more thin on the ground up until the 19th century. Can you see to that? Someone at the door, can you believe? Right, so 19th century is when we, in the 1800s, is basically when we get our first sort of connections or documentations of wise women and their role in the community. Now, to begin with, that was just the odd, what was it? Oh, right. To begin with, that was just the odd reference, possibly with court cases when, I mean, you do get good and bad in all walks of life, and certainly wise women were no exception. One of the terms for a wise woman, often in this country, in Britain in particular, is a cunning woman. And conning is not a million miles away from cunning, let's face it. So there were a few sort of renegade, sort of wise women who ended up in court for one reason or another. And so we find snippets of this in court cases and things like that. I know that there were many witch trials back in the 16th century and things like that. And amongst them must have been wise women, but it's very difficult to extricate genuine wise women with people who just, community had been targeted for whatever reason. And at that time, it was definitely a witch craze. So anyone even remotely connected to those sort of practices was walking a very thin line. So anyway, back to the 19th century, then there are quite a few instances of wise women and wise men, or cunning women or cunning men. The general term seems to have been wise women and cunning men. There are other appellations as well. There have been known to be called conjurers, and also known to, in particular in Cornwall, to be referred to as pellers. And this is connected to the practice of spellcraft and repelling or dispelling things. So I gather that's where the term came from. Now, there are documented details, particularly down in our neck of the woods in West Cornwall, of two particularly, how should we say, famous or infamous, depending on the person, women in particular, although there was a very infamous man as well. However, there are a few examples of this, and they all seem to have not used Helston as their main stamping ground, although they didn't actually originate from that place in the first place. One case being, I suppose, one of the most notorious was someone called Granny Boswell. Now, as you probably can figure out by the name, she was of Romany extraction, and she came originally from Ireland and settled, if you can call it that, round about the West Cornwall area, but particularly was known for hanging around in the portals of the Blue Anchor, which is a pub that brews its own very potent beer called Spingo. And she was well acquainted with the healing properties of Spingo, shall we say. Nevertheless, she did have a practice, and people used to go to her for various items and various charms. But unfortunately, she over-imbibed in the Spingo rather a lot, so she developed a rather unsavoury reputation. I think basically, in a nutshell, she was probably an itinerant Romany person who we used to see quite a lot, certainly in my youth, around the streets in the 50s. Romanies going around selling bits of lace or white heather, or want to read your palm for extortionate amounts of money. And generally speaking, people used to actually pay them for this rather than run the risk of a Romany curse aimed at their way from a bad-tempered Romany. Anyway, Granny Boswell was famous for one particular occurrence, and we go back to whatever the date was, 18 something or other, when there was a general election, and the local MP was a Conservative, and he also was the proud owner of the very first automobile in Helston. So they thought it would be a very good idea to go around and pick up the constituents and take them to the voting station to place their vote, hopefully, for the Conservative Party. It was during one of these trips that Granny Boswell reeled out of the Blue Anchor further down the street, only to be faced with this steaming, noisy contraption that she'd never set eyes on before. And to be frank, no one else had either in Helston. So it was a fantastic thing to behold. Anyway, the driver or the chauffeur was a very bad-tempered man and told her clearly to get out of the way. I'm sure he used stronger terms than that, but I'm not going to enter into that today. But I'm sure you can imagine the scene. There is drunken Granny Boswell being told in no uncertain manner to clear off, which she didn't take too kindly to. So once the MP came out, he also acted in a very haughty manner. So she turned round and she broadly cursed him, and he cursed his automobile that it wouldn't even get to the end of the street, that accursed machine. And they just laughed at her and sort of revved up the engine and practically ran her over. And so sure enough, everyone watched the automobile as it went down the street. And about 2/3 of the way down the street, there was this almighty explosion. And one of the main crankshafts, or whatever they call them underneath, had split. So as you can imagine, Granny Boswell's street cred went right up at that point, because she was then seen as the only person to have cursed successfully an automobile. So that went down very well. She's actually buried near where we live in a place called Newbridge. And there are pictures in the Helston Museum of her funeral. And interestingly, and understandably, there are a lot of Romany people who camped out overnight for the funeral service. It's in a little chapel. But also the local poor people, the peasantry, and also, interestingly, the gentry, which goes to show that wise women deal with people from all walks of life. And it covered the whole road. In fact, there was no room left in the chapel and people had spilled out across the road. So her funeral was very well attended. So whether they approved of her or not, they thought highly of her in her abilities. And often we go out and visit her grave, but we always make sure we take a bottle of Spingo with us, because she wouldn't take too kindly if we went along empty-handed. Now, the other very famous person who developed a very good reputation was someone called Tamsin Bly, commonly known as Tammy Blee. Now, she, I believe, was born in the St Day area, and she ended her days in Helston, in Coinage Hall Street. And she used to run surgeries, and she used to have people queuing up in the street to go and see her, to get, and particularly on the spring equinox, because that's a traditional time to renew charms that are sort of long-standing, ones that need to work over a long period of time. So, like I say, they used to queue up, and she used to have a little waiting room, and then they'd go upstairs. But sadly, we never knew what actually went on up there, because that part wasn't documented. And besides which, I dare say she operated as much as we do today under the umbrella of confidentiality. It's not a good idea to, well, you've got to maintain that confidentiality, and otherwise you won't get very far. She also married a rather dubious young man, so she had a bit of a toy boy there, and he's the one that got into trouble, but I'm not going to go into that too deeply, because basically this talk is about wise women. So we have some very, excuse me a minute, good examples there of wise women. So they did exist, and they existed, like I say, I believe they've always been there, but the documentation kind of starts from around about that time. And why were they there? Well, basically they were there because these are the days before the NHS, and we're very fortunate in this country to have an NHS. So what you're looking at there is wise women in particular operated within the disenfranchised, within what we loosely called the peasant community, the working class, the people that didn't have an awful lot of money. So they couldn't afford to pay for a doctor. They couldn't afford to pay for a vet either. But then, no, nothing new there. But certainly before the National Health, you are looking at, they were very much some of the health workers within their communities. Often they were midwives. Often they were called what is now termed soul midwives, i.e. they were there at end of life as well as at the beginning. And they also were there to lay out the dead whenever necessary. So they were there, very much there at what we could term rites of passage nowadays. Often they operated within their communities, whether that was rural or urban. Often they used to go to markets to sell their services. There were thoughts that within a market situation, you would get lots of different people selling lots of different things. And the way to tell what type of wise woman and what their expertise was in was by colour. Normally, they would wear a coloured cloak or hat. And they used to say that red would denote someone who was particularly good at charms. Green would be someone skilled in herbalism. Black, I'll leave you to figure out what that one was for, but that was called upon as well. So, and this is an interesting bridge here, I think I will make at the moment, because I'm also going to talk about contemporary practices, because the first thing people ask us is, well, what do you do? And basically, it hasn't really changed over the centuries what people want from wise women. And they're about the same things. They're about relationships. It's about their health. It's about their career or job. It's about their animals or their stock. And one very particular thing that they used to be there a lot for lost items. That was another one. We don't get that quite so much now, but we still get it. But the other biggie, if you like, is people who feel they've been cursed, or the whole issue of curses in the first place. So, seeing as we do the same things, I think I'm just going to move across to, if you like, contemporary practices. Now, at the moment, there's a bit of a fashion or a trend going on nowadays, and I think it kind of started to kick in the sort of late 60s, early 70s, with new spiritualities, new age, people looking at spiritual stuff in a different way. And then we had the rise of witches and witchcraft. And that's when we became aware of, particularly after, well, really, I suppose it's after the 50s, when they changed the Witchcraft Act. Because believe it or not, up until 1951, I believe, the Witchcraft Act was still in place in Britain. And then it was changed. I mean, it's called the Fraudulent Mediums Act, but also you could be convicted for witchcraft up until that point. Then that was changed, and it was repealed. That's when you started to get the rise of these things. And one thing that rose up very strongly was something we now term as Wicca, which has been recorded by a lot of historians and anthropologists as a new religion based on old practices, but nevertheless a new religion. And it was basically started by a chap called Gerald Gardner. And he drew a lot of his imagery, if you like, from Freemasonry, Rosicrucian stuff. And so we had the rise of witches, things like that. And it, like I say, it became that's when it got a bit confused, because people calling themselves witches and saying they were also a priestess. So you can imagine it gets a little bit confused, because witchcraft actually, in our opinion, is not a religion. It's, well, the clue's in the word. It's a craft. It's a technique, if you like. It's, we've view it as wisecraft. It's folk magic connected to folk medicine. It's just a way of perceiving the world. I've got to the point now where I don't consider myself to have a religion. I have strong beliefs, sure, but I think I would call myself more an animist. It's like seeing spirit in everything, basically. So the reason I'm talking about this is because sometimes there's a bit of confusion. I mean, in fact, there's a lot of confusion. So much has been written about it now by so many people. When I was much younger and first starting off in this craft, there was hardly anything there, hardly any books or anything like that, and it's very difficult to find people who are actually into it. And now I feel very sorry for people who genuinely want to find a little bit more about it, because there's just so much and you have to sift through so much, because particularly nowadays with everything about false news and fake news, how do you tell what's the authentic stuff and what isn't? Very difficult. All I know is that Wicker is about as old as the National Health Service, slightly afterwards, and Cunningcraft and Wisewomen and stuff like that goes back a bit further and is more connected to peasant magic and folk magic. So, practices. Goodness, where do we begin? Do you want to talk about charms a bit first? Because I'm getting a bit...
Okay, yeah.
So talking about charms, it's very much part of a wise woman's practice, and very much was in a much older times, back in the 19th century, charms were used a huge amount of the time. And there are some particular traditional charms that Laetitia will talk about now and what they represent. So I'm going to have a bit of a break, and here's Laetitia for you.
Hiya. Right, with charms, we get people come to us for different reasons, and you know, because you can make charms for most things. I think the most popular one is charms to draw love to people if they're looking for a relationship, or prosperity, good luck, healing. So different subjects. Before we actually do a charm for anyone or cast a spell, we always say that we would prefer to give them a reading first, because we can look deeper into the situation through doing a reading, and also get guidance on the best way to help them. So that's what we suggest, and a lot of clients are willing to do that, just so that we can get to the root of what is going on, particularly if someone feels that they've been cursed. We like to do a reading to look deeper into that situation, to find out whether there actually is a curse there, or whether they just fear that there's one. So yeah, the reading is a very good sort of diagnostic tool to help with what you're going to do next. Normally, if we decide to do a charm, is we get certain things off a person. We get contact items, which can be a photograph. We have had clients send a piece of hair to us, because that's one of the strongest contact items that you can use. So when they sent us that, they also send us their date of birth, because then we look at the planetary activity around their birth sign and what is happening at the moment, to find out the best days to make a charm or to do a reading, etc. So once we've got those details, I will construct the charm. So then I will get a table of correspondences that correspond to each reason for making a charm. So I will actually make a pouch in a certain colour. that corresponds to what they want. So if it was something to do with healing and you were working with moon energies, you would use the colour white or silver. You can use those colours for that. So I will make the pouch, and then with the corresponding numbers to the subject that you're dealing with, I will put so many items in the pouch that correspond to those numbers. So I will get a piece of muslin cloth, lay it in a bowl, and then I will collect different items to go into that charm. And they can be made of metal, they can be crystals, stones, or shells. I use pieces of shells because I work with the sea as well. Also, there's different incenses, herbs, plants, trees. There's so many different kinds of things that correspond to the reasons that you are creating the charm. And then I will put their piece of hair in with that, sew it all up, and then we will actually look at the planetary activity again and tell them the exact time and date that we'll be magically energizing the charm, and get them to actually connect with us at that time. And then once the charm is energized, I will post it to them, and they will let me know that they've got it, and I will send them instructions on how to acknowledge the charm every day, how to energize it themselves, say on the night of a full moon. And I contact them every full moon, because I've also got a spell shelf that I activate, or I give it a boost on full moons with different spells on it. And I will connect with the clients every full moon to ask them how they're getting on, whether they still need the spell in place or the charm or whatever. And we go from there. So it's constant connection with the client after you've actually done the service for them.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that. Just gives me a bit of a break from all this gassing. I'm trying to cram into a very short amount of time something I would take all afternoon in a workshop talking about. So it's quite difficult in that sense. Now, why do we have charms? What the heck's a charm, and what's all that about? Well, basically, it's when you work with people, they are coming because they've got a problem, quite frankly. So they come to us for a consultation, and the first thing you ask them for is, okay, what's the presenting problem? How can I help you? How can we help you? And a lot of things are very connected to psychology. I mean, if you look back at the sort of work that Wisewomen used to do, a lot of it, a huge amount of it actually falls into the category of counselling, what nowadays would be called counselling. But also it's from observation as well, looking at patterns, the way people are. Some people could come along with what I call a presenting pattern. It's like, I don't know why I keep having problems with relationships, for instance. And maybe, and this is, Laetitia's already referred to this, we do a reading. That's usually a tarot reading, which I've done more years than I can remember now. I've got a very battered tarot pack that I use. And it's, in a sense, it's my diagnostic tool. It's all very well sort of treating symptoms, but unless you look at the cause, you're just going to get the same thing happening in just a slightly different way. So I found that a tarot reading will get to the cause of, or at least to give you a glimpse of what's going on here. So then maybe we can do something about it. Because what I have found a lot of the time, and it's connected to physical health as well as mental health, we stuff an awful lot of things we don't want to look at and bury it in our unconscious minds. And it's, or what I call our deep minds. It seems to be an area of shove it all down the basement sort of reaction to things. And when something's shut away like that, it doesn't keep very well, but there are ways of accessing that, because as you and I know, however many times we consciously say, right, I'm never going to do that again because it's bad for me, there we are doing it before we even know it. And that's because our unconscious does not respond to a conscious command very easily. But what it does respond to is symbolism and archetypes and rituals, and it's like a big kid in a way. It will respond to things that responds to its senses, and it's deeply symbolic. It's the world of the archetype, that royal road to the unconscious that Jung talked about. And it's through dreams and things like that. So a very good way of accessing that, if you want to change a pattern, for instance, that is revealing itself for its presenting symptoms, then you can do a spell, or you can create a charm. And a charm is simply a container of some description that holds symbolic items that will have an effect. And you tell people what these are for as well. You explain what you're doing, and you'd be amazed the effect it will have on people's psyche. Because I learnt enough because I was a nurse in the NHS for umpteen decades. So I saw the strong connection between the patient's emotional and social health or situation and what they're physically suffering from. There is a very strong link, which you ignore at your peril, really. So I'm really pleased to see at least some sort of effort going into in medicine nowadays to look at the whole person and not just a load of symptoms. So that's why we do the things we do. It's not just a load of arm waving and hocus pocus. There's very little arm waving as far as I'm concerned. But it can be great fun. I mean, I'm not into the ceremonial stuff, but you're very good at it, aren't you? But yeah, it does come in handy for things like rites of passage, like the hatches, matches and dispatches, if you like, the baby naming, the hand fastings that we did one last Saturday. It was great. And the last rites, of course. These are all really important life rituals. And they do react well. People who attend these react really well to a certain amount of ceremonial. It doesn't frighten horses so much, does it? So, yeah. So we are there to help people. We are there to help people in the community. We are there to help maintain community. And this is why we're involved in so many community events that are going on, because community festivals and rituals, if you like, community rituals, are really important to the psyche of the community. They're what is known as abreactive, which is a rather odd word, but what it means is it evokes an emotional response from people. So you get midsummer festivals like Maisie Day down in Penzance, where people it's an excuse to enjoy themselves. And basically these events used to happen roughly every 6 weeks. There was an event for something or other, especially if you look at the Cornish calendar. There was the Harvest Festival, which we still do down here in Cornwall, you know, cutting the last sheaf and crying the neck and things like that. These were ways where the community gathered together. And by doing that, by keeping that sense of community, it's a type of healing. So we are very hot on keeping these things alive. And it's very important to us. There is a lot out there about people writing about the sort of things we do, but there's not an awful lot of doing it, I've noticed. Lots of books about it, lots of writings about it, not very many active practitioners. And I would say that anyone who pertains to be a wise woman or a cunning woman needs to have a clientele. And we do have and have had for years and years and years. And then just moving on to bring Laetitia back in again, just to briefly introduce the fact, I got to a certain age where I thought, I need an apprentice. I need someone to hand this on to. I had been thinking that for quite a while, and I had been keeping an eye open, shall we say, for someone who may be suitable. And I knew kind of that it was going to be one of those situations where I'd know them when I saw them, even though you go through your head, what sort of person would you need? Well, you'd certainly need someone who was observant. Anyone that just walks around with blinkers on is no good. You need someone who can see patterns in things. You need someone that's hardworking, because there's a certain amount of old-fashioned qualities required to be a wise woman. That's dedication, the ability to work hard, perseverance is very important, because you've got to keep at things. The ability to get on with other people. But most of all, you have to have the focus for it. You have to have the willpower for it. So you need to have a strong mind. And these are qualities, but plus that extra something that I knew I would know when I saw it. And there were quite a few people who came up as possibilities, but they didn't stay around long because they showed themselves not to be the case. Because you put people through these little tests and trials, try them out if you like. And they've got to find out whether they are going to get on with me as well. You know, it works two ways. So, yeah, because I think it's important to hand it on. And this is why I like doing things with people like Kresen Kernow, is because it's so important to hand things on. There's so much lost otherwise when someone dies, and, you know, you could lose a whole wealth of information purely through, you know, sort of good-hearted but muddle-headed people sort of dealing with their belongings afterwards, not realising, actually, you've got something really important here, social history. And I know there's very little written about wise women. So I've been keeping sort of notes and things. But I wanted to hand on my skills to someone else, not to turn them into a clone of me at all. Because the way I teach is, right, this is the way I do whatever it is. Do you get the idea of what I'm saying? Yes, I do. Great. Now find your way of doing that, because it's really important that the person uses their own potency, their own potential energy. And I think that's a sufficient enough sort of introduction to Laetitia, who used to be my apprentice, but who is now a fully fledged wise woman in her own right with her own skills. Take the floor, Laetitia.
Yeah, it's not, I know that many people read about apprenticeships. You know, it was like when I first thought about meeting a wise woman, I'd read lots of books on, you know, sort of fairy tale type books, and I expected to find an elderly woman living in the woods on her own, that she saw no one. But instead I found a wise woman that was very sociable, was out there doing community work. And it's I think a lot of storybooks give the wrong impression of what wise women are and how they can be within a community, because community is one of the most important parts of the work we do. Yeah, so Cassandra wasn't exactly what I thought I would find when I found someone to learn from, because it was the old craft I was looking for. I've done Wiccan training. I was disappointed when I found out it was only from the 1950s, because I knew there was something older that I hadn't quite touched. And so I went on a search for that, you know, getting involved in lots of groups and things, and quickly leaving them when I found out it wasn't what I was searching for. But it wasn't until I moved to Cornwall, where I felt a connection from childhood, that I found the old craft that I was looking for. And it was, I first met Cassandra, not for the wise woman part, it was more about performance, because she's been the teaser of an obios for about 20 years, and she was looking for someone to train. And someone actually suggested me to her because they knew that I used to Morris dance, and I was involved in that time for community festivals before, so they thought I would be right for the part. So I originally came to her for an interview about doing the performance, and then she talked about the wise woman work and that she wanted to hand that on to someone. So I thought, yeah, I'll try that as well, see how I get on with it. And then by trying that, I actually found what I was looking for, which was great, actually. It just all seemed to fall into place. But apprenticeships aren't easy. You get your boundaries well and truly pushed. You get tested all the time. You face your fears. There is so much about going through the process of being an apprentice. And as well as that, it brings up your past, it brings up things you have to deal with within yourself, as well as learning the work that you've got to do with the community. So that's why I've written a book that is coming out in March about what it's like to be an apprentice, what it was like to live in Cornwall compared to the fantasy that many have who'd love to live here because they have great holidays and they think, oh, that would be so nice. But when you actually live here, you're so busy surviving, you don't get the time to go and see the places you'd like to see. It's very rarely that you do that, because you're working to survive, basically. So and every day is different. Being a wise woman, you get called on for many different things. So you don't know what's coming each day. It's quite an adventure, actually, for the people that, you come in contact with and what they want. And you're out one day, you'll be doing a hand fasting. Another day, I'll be teaching Reiki courses, because I teach those as well. I do healing work, I do counselling. So every day is different for me, and it's an adventure, but it's one that it's taught me a lot about myself as well as about other people. Okay.
I see we've got a black cat that's joined us as well. Right, is that about it, Amanda?
Oh, it's me. Yeah, that's fine. Have you finished? Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you very much.
I'd like to hear what other people would like to hear, basically.
Yeah, fine, yeah. Oh, hang on, we're starting to get some questions. There was a question earlier.
Okay.
I'm just going to stop the recording.